call this a peak at the peak. And I'd like to start thinking about the Peak District at Dovedale. This, many of you will know as the very peaky, pointy hill that's called Thorpe Cloud. And there's another one on the other side called Bunster Hill. And the two of them are sort of portals to the first part of upland Britain. Now, the famous walking writer Alfred Wainwright argued that this portal between these two hills should be the start of the Pennine Way, because it was the beginning of upland Britain. Well, all I can say is he was a great guy, but thank God he didn't get his way, because there's already more than enough people pouring into Dovedale on a busy weekend or even a busy weekday. So as many of you will know, that the Pennine Way actually starts further north at Edale, but it's kind of iconic and it's very peaky and pointy. Let's have a quick look at some of the other parts of the Peak District. There we are, that's Dovedale. But then coming up to the northeast, we're at the Lady Bower and Derwent Dams, actually artificial, but blending in rather well, I think, with the natural surroundings. There's another view where the water actually does enhance the scenery. That reservoir's down a little bit there. Another typical peaklands view. Here we've got those long fields divided up by typical dry stone walls, and you can see the squeeze gap next to the public footpath sign. Aren't those squeeze gaps small? They're tight, aren't they, very often? But there's lots of those, and of course these date back to the period of the enclosures. Rainster Rocks, which is not too far from here in Wirksworth, where you get this wonderful view down onto the ridge and furrow features, actually showing very clearly the medieval strip farming. So up until now, we've had a look at a few images of the Peak District, and only the very first one was peaky and pointy. So do you think they got the name wrong? Should it have actually been called the Plateau District? It's far more of a plateauy kind of place than it is peaky pointy. Thorpe Cloud is an exception rather than totally characteristic of the peak. Well, the truth actually lies in this word, the Pexatans. The Pexatans were a group of Anglo-Saxons who inhabited in the area. So actually the peak from Pexatan has nothing to do with pointy things at all, and comes back to the names of the people who first lived here, or not first, but early inhabitants. Now, my father has been a great campaigner for countryside access, and he died at the age of 103 only 9 months ago. So he had a very good innings. And back in 1948, he took my mum on a date. And the date he took her on was to the Strangers Gallery in the House of Commons, where they actually watched the second reading, I think it was, of the National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act, because the two of them believed that countryside access was a really important cause. Well, I'm delighted to say that the Act passed, and even more importantly, as far as I'm concerned, they had more romantic dates later on, and I'm the product of that. But probably the important thing about this Act of Parliament is that the very first national park to be designated under that Act was the Peak District. And here is a picture I really like from 1954. It's 3 years after the Peak District was designated as a park. And here's a group of countryside rangers. I think these are volunteer rangers setting off probably at a weekend and pointing up to, I'm pretty sure this is up to Bleaklow. I think that's where they are. I think the dress code is worth looking at, and of course the gender balance. but it's quite interesting the sorts of things people were walking in. And this guy here at the back with the armband, I'm absolutely sure he had some important role in it all. Well, let me show you some of the countryside rangers much more recently. There we are, brighter clothing, and I think a gender balance which somehow feels a little bit more comfortable. I'm told that since this picture was taken, which is about, I think probably about 8 years ago, the uniform has changed again. But anyway, very important people who are out there looking after the park for us. But it's been a lot longer than since 1951 that people have regarded the Peak as a great place to come and visit. Now, one of my favourite spots is the museum in Buxton, and some of you will know this. And in the museum, there is a glass case, and there is this wonderful book, De Mirabilis Peccae, being the wonders of the Peak in Derbyshire, spelt with an A. This is a book written in 1678, and it's written in Latin by Thomas Hobbes of Malmesbury. Thomas Hobbes, is a famous philosopher, and he is well known for introducing the idea of the social contract, but he wrote that in Latin. And the English is written by a person of quality, which I think is very interesting. And let's just have a little careful look at the subtitle that this person of quality chose to give to the book. I've been to the museum 3 times to look at this, and every time I go, I say to the person on the desk, it's a great book, I'm really interested in it, I use it in my talks. Is there any chance of turning the page so we can see what the next page says? And every time they're very helpful, and they say, I'm sure that'll be okay, but the curator's not here this week, come back next week. And I've never managed to catch the curator. So in time, I will come to one of my talks in a few years' time, and I might be able to tell you a little bit more about what it contains. But there's a really important point here, which is that the landscape and the atmosphere of the Peak is a place that's been celebrated for centuries. Here's a map of the Peak District National Park, and it shows you the land in green that was designated. And you'll actually see that the town of Buxton is not included in the park, it's just outside. And the only town of any size in the park itself is Bakewell. Wirksworth itself is just off the bottom, but only a mile or so from the boundary of the park. This chunk of land here near Buxton was excluded, and I think that was largely because it's sites of an awful lot of mineral extraction. There were a lot of quarries and so on, and it wasn't considered that the landscape justified the protection. I used to work in Glossop, and I'm very fond of Glossop, but it always amuses me to see the way that the boundary of the park round the town of Glossop gave it a good mile from the centre. So it's very much, the Peak District Park itself is very much rural. Little bit of geology, and I know we've got Martin, my geology friend, here on as part of the webinar tonight. So nice to see you here, Martin. And I think he's approved this, although it's slightly simplistic. The Peak Park is basically a dome, and the youngest rocks, and therefore the rocks on the top, are millstone grit, which is a kind of sandstone. In the southern part of the park, in the area around Wirksworth, that sandstone has been largely eroded, not completely, but largely eroded, which means that the limestone in the middle has been exposed, so that we actually get an awful lot of limestone. And typically, in the southern part of the Peak Park, the gritstone appears on the east and on the west, because it's the remains of the dome here. Although you do get other crops of gritstone which come as a result of folding and other geological activity. So this does mean sorry, let's just be clear that in the north, the northern part of the park, the Millstone Grit is continuous. And although there is limestone, it's actually hidden beneath. So it's entirely gritstone. But this does mean that we have two parts of the park. We have the dark peak in the north, and there's a map from the Ordnance Survey that covers that. This is the gritstone area, and we have the white peak in the south, which is the limestone area. And there's a map for each of those. So let's just visit briefly the white peak area. I think the first thing to say is it's more grey than white, but it's so much lighter than the dark peak that it kind of justifies the term white. I once showed this picture to a group of people who actually were on an HF holiday, and I said, this is what we call a dry valley. And they burst out laughing because they said, well, we've been down there today, Alistair, and it's dead boggy in the bottom. But we call it a dry valley because there's no permanent river running down it. This valley will have been created at a time when there was far more surface water around, probably in the post-glacial period, and may have been many of these limestone valleys were actually created as underground tunnels, which actually then collapsed. So that's a very typical dry valley. A typical white peak plateau scene with these wonderful dry stone walls, which really do create an important part of the atmosphere, and the plateau stretching away. Interestingly, just on the right here, we can see the cap of an old lead mine, and we'll talk about those a bit later. Also important in the White Peak are the underground caves, and there are lots of them. We don't even know about all of them, but this is dove holes on the River Dove. This is a group of people on a walking holiday, and they're exploring them, and that's very, very characteristic of the White Peak. Limestone, of course, is not porous. Porous means the water actually gets inside the structure of the rock, but it is pervious, meaning it's got loads of cracks in it, and the water can kind of can find its way through, which it's doing there. You can see down to the bottom. It's really the reason there's very little surface water, and this has led to something which we in Wirksworth know an awful lot about. But some of you who've joined us, Klaus from Germany, Pat from California, great to see you there, and Belinda, I think, from Suffolk. So just a few of the people who've joined us from far away may know less about the tradition of well dressing. This is very much a pre-Christian tradition, which has been adopted and continued and supported by the Christian Church. The original idea being, of course, to make encouraging images by the sides of water sources, whether they be springs, wells, and more recently, in fact, taps in the street, standpipes. And the images are always made with natural materials in a large frame, which will be filled with puddling clay. That's the medium in which the natural materials, petals, leaves, stones, moss, all sorts of things are used to make the images. And here's some people here in Wirksworth actually working on one of the well designs, and that was very successful. Of course, it's one of those things which has not happened this year in the usual way, but a rather interesting project has happened here in Wirksworth and several other local towns, is that small mini well dressing images have been created about the size of a piece of A4 paper. So the tradition has been maintained even this year, but in a different way. I just do love these flowers. They're a little bit of an exception, but there's a wonderful place. We saw the hill Thorpe Cloud right at the beginning, and there is, rather exceptionally because of the geological conditions, a little spring that does come out of the side of the limestone there. And in places where you get limestone and water together, you get these hybrid monkey flowers, and they really do look like they're yellow flowers that somebody's come along with a red paint pot and flicked the paint all over them. So a bit of a gem, that. So this is the Peak Park's analysis of what the sense of place would be in the White Peak. High, open plateau, stone walls, pastoral farmland and limestone villages. It's reinforced by the visually prominent dales that dissect the plateau. Plateaus, not peaks, remember here, folks. So that's the White Peak, and it's quite high, sometimes a bit remote, but actually rather a comfortable and a jolly place to be. The Dark Peak is a more serious matter. It's far more remote, it's higher, the weather can be tougher, and the rock is a lot darker. This is on the side of Kinder Scout, coming up to the Gritstone Plateau there, and you do more often get surface water on Gritstone, but it's not in this picture, but can quite often be discolored, a brown color, because of the peat through which it has previously flowed. And here we have a famous Wirksworth mountaineer standing on top of one of the trig points on the top of the Kinder Plateau. This is Rob Tresidder. And as well as Rob's climbing skills there, you can see the terrible problem of erosion, because these pillars were erected in the 1930s mostly, and you can see that this here will have been the original ground level, and in fact all of this here, which is well, probably at least a couple of feet, has been eroded away, and that's a big concern, and the Peak Park have tried to work on managing the footpaths with gritstone slabs so that the erosion is reduced. Another view which is quite typical of the Dark Peak is the heather, which is encouraged because it forms, or the small heather shoots are a really good source of food for the grouse, and the grouse are a really good source of food for the people who shoot them. Time was when we could remember that actually these sections of heather used to be burnt. That happens much less nowadays, but nevertheless it is cut back to encourage fresh growth, because it's the fresh growth of the heather that forms an important source of food for the grouse. Now, you'll have heard of the talk of the right to roam, and this symbol here indicates that all of the land beyond the post is access land, and access land means that this is somewhere where you can actually walk wherever you would like. It's right to roam land. I once took a group of people out and we saw the symbol, but it didn't have the words access land underneath. And I did say to them, I said, do you know what this symbol means? Oh, yeah, we know what this means. Oh, we know all about this. It means men likely to get stuck in mud. So sometimes the symbols that are created do need a little bit more explanation than we think. Anyway, that symbol appears on quite often on Ordnance Survey maps now to indicate that they show the open access land, and there's a particular way in which that is shown on maps. So it's very useful. I think this is highly amusing. This land is designated as crow access land. Well, isn't that nice that crows are allowed to come here and access it? Terrible piece of jargon. I don't know why they've used this. Crow actually stands for the Countryside Rights of Way Act 2000, but the notion that it's crow access land, why don't you just say it's access land? Coming back to the Gritstone Plateau, very often get these tor-like features. Tors are very often associated in people's minds with the granite of the southwest of England, but in fact very similar forms are created at the tops of these limestone plateaus, and in fact Gritstone plateaus, and in actual fact the likely method of creation is that the original level of the land would have been level with the top of this tor, and that in fact it's the area underneath here which was eroded away and just leaving this section. They form some wonderful shapes, and those shapes quite often generate quite poetic names, and there's an anvil and cakes of bread and so on. I think that's one of the joys of the High Peak, or the Dark Peak. So the sense of place for the Dark Peak, it's famed for its desolate and exposed tracts of moorland tops stretching great distances to create a sense of remoteness. The moorland tops appear dark due to the gritstone. So we've got these two contrasting landscapes, and the landscapes map by and large to the main geology. Okay, I did go on a photography course a few years ago. It's quite expensive, and I did learn some things. And you'd think I hadn't, because this is badly framed, isn't it? I've chopped off one of the chimneys on this house. So I do apologise, but there's a story behind it. This is in a little village, or decent sized village of Hartington, and I set myself up there one Sunday morning and was out there just framing up the picture, and the owner of the house came up to me and said, "Hey mate, what are you taking a picture of my house for? Are you from the council?" So I explained that it was because I was going to give a talk, and his house was quite an interesting. Anyway, he was very unconvinced, so I just took the picture and left. The reason I took it was because it shows how the two types of stone are frequently used in architecture. The gritstone, the millstone grit, is far easier to dress and to create clear rectangular blocks. So it's used for the places that need to be straight. So the coins, as they're called, the corner of the building is made here with bits of it's not that dark, it's got quite a reddy color to it, but this is the gritstone. The frames of the windows and the door frames are all made of gritstone, and everything else is these almost random limestone blocks, which they call rubble sometimes. This is a very common combination of rocks. So if you're visiting the peak, do look out for that. And here is quite a nice spot. Again, people will know this if they know people from Wirksworth. This is Black Rocks looking over, which is gritstone, and there's very interesting history behind how this actually slid into position, which Martin explained to me about a year ago on a walk, so thank you for that, Martin. But it overlooks a limestone quarry, and you really can see the contrast in the colours. I'd just like to reassure anybody who might be tempted to come out on one of the walks that I lead, or some of my colleagues with HF Holidays. These people sitting on the edge of that rock were not part of our group, and that was not part of the risk assessed activity for the day, because it certainly worried me sitting watching them there. Grit, obviously millstone grit gets its name because the stone was very good for making milling stones, primarily for grinding grain. And here you can see two complete stones at the bottom here, which have been dressed, and the pattern that's cut into the stones actually ensures that the grain, which is fed into the middle of the upper moving stone, makes its way to the outside of the stone, and by the time it's actually reached the outside of the moving stone, it's ground down into meal. I did a study years ago on the water mills on the River Wey in Surrey, and every single one of the documented mills that I found down there had two types of stone. They had French burrs, which were the granite stones, and they had peak stones. The peak stones, not quite as hard as the granite, and so they did tend to be used more often for animal feed, because the animals were less worried if there were little bits of sand in what they were eating. In addition to using this for grinding corn, of course, the stones were used for other purposes, for crushing and as sharpening stones, and very important for the industry, the cutlery industry in Sheffield. You could be out for a walk in the countryside and you believe you're in a completely wild and remote place, and you have a look around, you have a look in the woods and you think, that rock's a little bit on the round side. And of course, you realise that you're in an old millstone quarry, and there are lots of these. Sometimes the millstone is perfect and it's just been left there. In other cases, you find millstones that have fallen over and cracked. But in this case, you just wonder whether the people went home one Friday night and decided not to come back to work on Monday morning, or maybe they were called up and went to war. Nobody ever really knows the full story, but it's a great part of the local landscape. National Stone Centre, just up the hill from here in Wirksworth, a great place to visit. And I just love the amphitheatre. If you haven't seen the amphitheatre, do go and have a look at it. This is geologically chronological. The older rocks are at the bottom and the newer rocks are at the top. So it's a gem of a place just to see the succession of geology. And the Millennium Walls very close by are also great. When in the year 2000, dry stone wall makers from all over the country descended on the area with their piles of stones, and they made their 3 meters of walls. So you can actually find walls from the north of Scotland, from the west of Wales, and from the southwest peninsula as well. So that's a great one. Right, okay. I did say that Buxton's not technically in the Peak Park, but that's not what they think when you arrive there, as you can see by the sign. And of course, there's what people consider to be the Peak District and what people actually choose, or what the National Park Authority has actually defined as its official limits. So the Romans were here many years ago. They were interested in 2 particular things. They were interested in the lead, but they were also interested in the natural water spring which appears here. And many of you will have heard of Buxton Water, I'm sure. This is where it comes from. It's St Anne's Well, and I'm sure some of you have actually gone there and tried it. St Anne was the mother of Virgin Mary, and the water comes out of the ground quite warm. You can actually just go and collect it and help yourself for nothing there, which is rather a nice thing to be able to do. Driving back from the south of England at the end of last year, I stopped at Leicester Forest East service station. I went to the toilet and I noticed that in Waitrose you could also buy 1 litre for £2.49. £2.49 for a litre of the stuff that comes out of the Lion's Head here for nothing. So I wonder whether that's actually worth it or not. Well, I've got 2 glamorous assistants with me today, Roger and Gordon, who work here at the Heritage Centre, are going to take a test. They've got 2 bottles. One of them is bottle A, and one of them is bottle B. Okay, now one of them contains tap water and one of them contains Buxton water. I'm not going to ask them which is which. I'm going to ask them to try both and tell me which one they prefer. So over to you, fellas.
Okay, we're just pouring water.
Jolly good. So start with A so that we don't get confused.
Cheers.
Is this A? Yeah.
Yeah.
I was very insistent earlier that they had a fresh glass for the second water so that it didn't get contaminated by the first glass. Okay, that's glass A, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, if you'd like to go to glass B. You might need a little bit of thinking time, fellas. So, Gordon, do you have a preference?
Not really, no, but B is slightly softer.
Which one?
B.
B is slightly softer, but you don't have a strong preference?
No.
Roger, do you have a strong preference between the 2?
Yeah, so there's a subtle difference between them. I'd agree with Gordon that B is slightly softer. It feels less harsh, if you like. It depends what mood I'm in. If I want to be woken up in the morning, it will be A. If I want a nice soft drink in the evening, it'll be B.
Well, so my question to you is this, Roger. Is B £2.49 a litre better?
We don't know which one is which, do we?
B is the Buxton water. Is it worth an extra £2.49?
Oh, definitely.
Definitely. Would you pay an extra £2.49, Gordon?
No.
You'd stick with the tap water. And of course, if you don't want to pay thank you very much. Can we have a round of applause for these guys, please? Yeah, thank you very much for taking the test. And if you don't want to pay the £2.49, well, all you need to do is do like this lady who turned up, actually from Leicester, strangely enough, but not from the service station, with piles of bottles. That's not all of the bottles that she brought. She had many others, and she was filling them up and taking them back. And I think people who know Buxton will know that this happens very, very often. And so the people who really care about this come and take it very seriously. And when I was there taking these photographs and collecting the water, I met this chap. This man was making cement. He was making cement with water that retails at £2.49 a litre. And yet he said, well, it's the easiest place to get the water, mate, so that's what I'm going to do. So the water is quite an important feature of Buxton. And here's a guy collecting it especially for tonight, so it really did come from there. Okay, we've talked about the Dark Peak and the White Peak. By the time you get to Buxton and start going north, you start hearing about the High Peak. Well, the Dark Peak is higher, so there's High Peak Borough Council and High Peak Radio, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if there's a High Peak pizza shop and a High Peak laundrette, because everything is High Peak. But what about a Low Peak? Now, people actually don't talk very much about a Low Peak. It doesn't tend to get used occasionally, but not very much. However, we do talk about lows. And here is Minning Low, which is the site of prehistoric burials from several periods, starting, they think, in the Stone Age and going right through to Bronze and Iron Age. And the burial mounds are actually on the top of that hill, which is surrounded by those trees. So that's Minning Low. And on the top of another hill, we have the Stonehenge of the North, Arbor Low. Now, it's quite an impressive location, and some of you will know this well, but it's got, Stonehenge has got something on Arbor Low, which is that the stones haven't fallen over at Stonehenge. The stones are all on their sides here, but it's another low, that's high up. So the explanation is that all of these lows throughout the area that are high come from the Saxon word chlor, meaning a mound. So chlor has become low, and it's the mound, it's the burial mound on the top of the hill. But the lows are high. When we're talking about prehistory, this is one of my favourite spots, not far from Chatsworth House on Gardham's Edge. This is a cup and ring circle. They appear in all over the country. I've seen them in Northumberland, and I know they've been reported elsewhere. Nobody really has a convincing explanation or a widely accepted explanation to the use or the origin of these shapes. They're not identical when you find others, but they have similar versions of the patterns. Now this one I went to with my daughters on Christmas Day, and we had, it's not on a footpath, so to find it you've got to find the grid reference, and then you have to find a wall corner and walk in on a compass bearing. But we got there and we found it. And then my third daughter, who hadn't taken part, came in the summer And she said, oh, I want to go there as well. I want to go on a compass bearing. Well, we did, but just look what the bracken was like by July. It was a much more difficult thing to find. Well, this is my son-in-law and my daughter also pointing out this rock art, as it's so often called. Well, it's a great place to go and to find it. I think it's quite inspirational. And then you sit down on it and you tap it. And it makes a very funny noise. It doesn't sound like millstone grit at all. It's actually an artificial copy of the real cup and ring circles. The real ones were beginning to get weathered. They were covered up again, but this cast was taken and put there. But I defy anybody to go there and look at it from a distance and actually say which of these are stones and which of these are the copy. This, for example, is a real stone. So worth going to see. It's between Bircham Edge and Gardham's Edge. Talking about prehistory, here we have Hart Hill, Grey Ladies at Hart Hill Moor. I think there's 4 stones here at the moment, but back in the 19th century, there were 7, and there's a suspicion that there may have been more earlier on. This Thomas Bateman, who was an antiquarian, he was described as, found pottery and flints in the area. So there was clearly an awful lot of activity there. Like everything, these places have their own little histories. This is very close to Elton, and it's said that at midnight the stones dance. Well, I've never been there to see. And I do rather like this particular legend, which is that in the 19th century, it's said that a farm worker found a clay pipe. There's the clay, well, a clay pipe, not the one he found, but a clay pipe. And he picked it up and smoked it. And after he'd smoked it, he saw inside the center of the earth. Well, either he made the story up or there was something quite interesting in that pipe that wasn't tobacco. Very close to the Grey Ladies Hart Hill Moor is what I think is a smashing piece of rock. Sometimes it's called Mock Beggar's Hall, but I prefer the name Robin Hood Stride, because the idea, it has these 2 protruding rocks at either side, and the idea was that Robin Hood was such a great, strong and gigantic fellow that he could stride between the 2 of them. Now, I've done quite a lot of research on this, and I haven't failed to find a satisfactory photograph or picture of any sort or engraving of Robin Hood striding between those 2 rocks. So we're going to have to make do with a note from our sponsor. But you can imagine the way that it would have worked. Just to the right of Robin Hood Stride, there's this rather intriguing cliff called Gratcliffe. And you can actually see that this is another pile of rocks that hasn't got any protuberances, but the blue arrow tells you that there is a hermit's cave there. I've met people who've been twice to try and find the hermit's cave and have failed, because actually once you get into the wood, there's no obvious path to get there. But in fact, there's a real trick to finding it, and the trick to finding it is the yew tree. There are 2 yew trees there, and as you know, yew trees are always traditionally associated with religious sites, very often pre-Christian. And as you get there, you can see that the yew tree is actually shading the entrance to the cave. Now, the cave itself is not very deep, and you can see that there are in fact some socket holes here. So the hermit will have built out some kind of building out from the cave as well. Carol Sellers, who lives here in Wirksworth, has been doing some research into hermits generally in the county, and she's come up with some really quite interesting evidence, really. And one of the things she's discovered is that, in fact, hermits quite often didn't live alone, and they were sometimes even had servants working for them. So they didn't necessarily have very frugal lives, but what they did have was very isolated lives. The hermit here, and I don't know much about this business of having servants, and I look forward to seeing her research because she's going to share that soon. But that it is recorded that the hermit living here used to make money by being a guide, and he would take people on their road to Bakewell or on their road to Chesterfield, and he also used to sell rabbits to Haddon Hall. And this is the real gem when you get inside, because this crucifix is carved out on the rocks inside the cave, and you miss it actually if you're not careful when you get there, because it's quite warm. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been a great audience, and we've come now to halfway through. Well, actually more than halfway through, I think, but it's the point where we're going to take a break. So it's 20 past. I think we'll give you a chance to go and get a drink, go to the loo, or phone a friend, or whatever it is that you'd like to do. And I'm going to invite you back in 5 minutes, but I'll pass you over to Gordon, who will explain the procedure.
Hello again, everyone, and thank you, Alistair. Yes, we're going to take a short 5-minute break now, just for a quick toilet break, snacks, cup of tea or coffee, and we will reconvene in about 5 minutes. Just if you aren't leaving your screens though, if you would just like to chat or ask us any questions, well, I will still be here talking or chatting away in chat, so feel free to ask. Hello again, everyone. I hope you've all had a quick 5-minute break. Just before we get started and Alistair starts up again, just a couple of quick announcements that I'll repeat as well at the end. For anyone who's got questions regarding us reopening, please keep an eye out on our social media and our website. We will be announcing something before the end of the month regarding reopening. And also, please do keep an eye out on our Facebook, website, Twitter for various things about what we're doing at the Heritage Centre between now and then. There's a number of projects and things going on here that we'd like to support with. Now, I will just now, hopefully everything's finished. If people could just give me a quick show of hands to say that you're all back. Okay, I've got 13 hands, or 12. So, yes, someone's not quite decided yet. 14. We'll see if we get 15, and then we'll start. And then we'll start again. Oh, there. We've just hit 50. Oh no, gone again. No, someone's still not quite decided. I did. Oh, right. I think we're stable at 15 now. Hopefully. So without, I will not keep any longer, and over again to Alistair. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, nice to see you back. Thanks very much for coming. I wanted just to introduce that little bit of atmosphere that is Throwley Hall. Now, I would really like to ask you to note Throwley Hall and then just not tell anybody else, because it is one of those little quiet gems that is really lovely to visit. But its beauty comes from really the fact that so few people actually know about it. Now, there'll be people here who do know it, and I think I'm going to say a little bit about it, and then I want to take us to a few more rather interesting places that I like anyway. And there we are, Throwley Old Hall. Where is it? Well, it's actually above the River Manifold. And here's a map. So Throwley Hall is at the end of a very sharp turning on this road to the northwest of Ilam. Now, hundreds of people go to Ilam. They go to the beginning of Dovedale. They go to the Ilam Country Park, which is National Trust property, and so few make it up this little road here along the side of the Manifold and up this this road here. Now, if anybody's a cyclist, this descent on this hill here, coming in the opposite direction, starting at the top and coming down to Rushley and then to Ilam, is, I think, the best cycling descent in Derbyshire. It's absolutely wonderful. The hall itself has a long and checkered history going back to the Middle Ages. It was a sort of fortified manor house, and you've only got to look at the surrounding fields to see that in earlier days there were clearly more buildings around. But it was basically raided by its owner in the mid-19th century, and much of the architectural features were actually taken off to a house that the owner also owned in York. The nearby farm has got one or two rather overgrand features in it as well, which clearly came from the hall. So we've got a very atmospheric ruin, and it has plenty of ghost stories and other legends associated with it. In fact, you've only got to Google Throwley Hall on the internet and you will come up with all sorts of stories of ghost hunters. But something that intrigued me about Throwley Hall is that it's a very remote spot, and it became one of the meeting places for the Muggletonians. Now, I'm actually going to look. I bet there's not very many people here who've heard of Muggletonians. So maybe a few have. Well, the Muggletonians were a sect which set themselves up in the 17th century. They were at the same time as the Quakers, the Society of Friends being set up, but they considered themselves fierce rivals, and they would curse the Quakers. They had a belief that only men had souls. They had a belief that there was no need to have religious ceremonies. They did meet, but they met for discussions, socializing and debates, so they didn't have churches. And they didn't actually believe in evangelizing. Well, that probably led to their downfall as a sect, because the last known Muggletonian handed over all of the documentation to the National Archives in 1979. But Throwley Hall was one of the locations that they chose in order to have their meetings at the time when they were being basically persecuted. And there's a bit of a theme about this in the Peak. There are other very isolated valleys where other religious groups used to meet. There's a place called Allport Castles where there's a love barn, and there the so-called love, it was godly love, not carnal love. But at the time when the Methodists were frowned upon, they would go and have their quiet meetings in these places. So some of these very isolated places have a religious history. I think the interesting thing about the Muggletonians is that by the 1940s, there were two groups, one in London and one continuing to meet in Derbyshire. I'm not sure if they were meeting at Throwley Hall by that time, and they'd actually lost touch with one another. So a quirky thing. Let's talk about food. Food products of the Peak. We're very proud of our food, and I think the first thing that I always have to say to visitors and never have to say to local people is there ain't no tarts in Bakewell. They're puddings. And the Bakewell pudding is basically made of ground almond jam, butter and eggs. And if you go to Bakewell, you will find the original Bakewell pudding shop. A little bit further along the road, there's the genuine original Bakewell pudding shop, and somewhere else there's the real Bakewell pudding shop. So, and I do have to admit that some of them have seen the commercial advantage in trying to emulate Mr. Kipling, and there's a few Mr. Kipling style tarts, but they're not really Bakewells at all. And cheese. The area around Hartington in Derbyshire is one of the few places where you can actually make blue cheese and say that it is called Stilton cheese. And something that has really riles the people of the village of Stilton in Cambridgeshire is that if you make blue cheese, they're not allowed to call it Stilton. But the big creamery in Hartington, in that geographically designated area, did close a few years ago, but now there's some of the employees have set up a smaller enterprise where they make Hartington blue cheese, and it's on sale. And I have to say, it's wonderful. I once took my daughters to a cheese factory. They did say it was the most boring visit they'd ever done, because the only thing that ever happened in this factory was that once a week, all the staff would come and turn the cheeses up in the other direction. And I went on a cheese making course myself just before Christmas, and most of the cheese making involved turning the cheese upside down every so many days. Anyway, so we've got Bakewell puddings, and we've got this wonderful blue cheese, and then of course we've got Derbyshire bananas. Now, Derbyshire's role in bananas is legendary, as I hope you know, but just in case you don't, I'll just go through this. These are Cavendish bananas. They're named after William Cavendish, Duke of Devonshire. And they were cultivated at Chatsworth House, where the Duke lived, by the head gardener, who was called Joseph Paxton, in the greenhouses in 1836. So Paxton got this job as head gardener at Chatsworth House, and he reckoned that if he was going to be at all effective as a head gardener, he was going to need a greenhouse. So in that greenhouse, he cultivated these bananas, and this variety, the Cavendish variety of bananas, is now by far the most widely consumed and widely grown commercial banana in the world. And it's not often actually acknowledged when you go to a supermarket in Britain, but not so when you visit France. Because here we are in a French supermarket, and the bananas have come from Côte d'Ivoire, but c'est les bananes Cavendish. So look out for that next time you're in France, and remember that they're Derbyshire bananas. Okay, so here's the guy, Joseph Paxton, lived in the first part of the 19th century, and here's his greenhouse, the Great Conservatory at Chatsworth, and it's not there anymore, unfortunately, but it was a great success, not only as a piece of architecture, but as somewhere to generate new types of bananas. And of course, on the basis of building one of this rather impressive greenhouse, he got the contract to build the greenhouse of all greenhouses. That greenhouse was the Crystal Palace for the Great Exhibition in 1851. Now, some of you will have travelled through the railway station at Derby, and some of you may not. If you don't know the railway station at Derby, or if you've not noticed it, can I recommend to you the accessible toilet on platform 1? That's what it looks like, the accessible toilet on platform 1, and there's a gents' toilet a little bit further down and a ladies' toilet behind you. But the thing to look out for is this plaque next to the accessible toilet on platform 1 of Derby Station. Because when you read that very carefully, it says that it was in June 1850 that Joseph Paxton conceived his design for the Crystal Palace. I can only imagine that the trains must have been running very late that day if he had time to conceive and design the Crystal Palace. So anyway, definitely worth having a look at platform 1. While we're talking about railway stations, you probably recognise Charing Cross, and you may know that this particular Gothic cross here was reconstructed in the 19th century by the railway company, but it replicated one of the 12 Eleanor crosses that King Edward had erected after his wife, Eleanor of Castile, she died in Lincoln, body was transported to London, and one of those Gothic crosses was erected in each of the places where her body overnighted. And by the 19th century, Eleanor crosses became very popular, a sort of Gothic revival, and we've got our own one here in the Peak District. And here it is in the village of Ilam. It's been restored quite recently. It's considered to be a particularly good example. This was not one of the places where Eleanor's body was left to rest, but the idea of the cross was actually used by the local landowner to recognise his wife's death when she moved on. One of the advantages of the recent period of lockdown is that I am told there have been the occasional days when you could take this photograph without Mr. Whippy in the foreground. But for years, it was never possible to do that. So I really should have nipped up and got the Mr. Whippy free picture of the cross. And there we are. This is just describes that it was Mary Watts Russell, a memorial from her husband. Okay, while we're back down in that area, there's a nearby hotel called the Isaac Walton, and it commemorates the fact that this fella, Isaac Walton, was a very keen fisherman, and he actually was born in Staffordshire, not too far from Ilam, but he went down to London, had a shop, was doing quite well, but kind of backed the wrong side in the Civil War. He was a bit of a supporter of the king, so actually it wasn't a comfortable place to be. So during the period of the Commonwealth, he headed back home, headed for the hills, and he teamed up with his mate Charles Cotton, who was a local landowner, and wrote this great book about angling. It's written as a sort of conversation between people who are these guys who are interested in angling. One of them is called Viator, and there's a bridge on the River Dove, which is now called Viator's Bridge. Charles Cotton, as I said, was a landowner, lived in Beresford Hall, which is just south of Hartington, but he used to go to church at Alstonfield, and there's the church that he and his family, Charles Cotton, would frequent. And if you go in Alstonfield Church now, you can actually see the family pew. This is the Charles Cotton's family pew. It didn't used to face backwards. When they actually used it, it faced forwards, but now it's just kept there for show. So this was the place where Charles Cotton, and probably Isaac Walton as well, used to go and worship between maybe writing chapters of the Complete Angler. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to have a look at the hymn books in Alstonfield Church. You couldn't make it up, could you? You could not make it up. These are the hymn books. Right. Okay, so there we are. And at one end of Dovedale, you'll find the Isaac Walton Hotel. At the other end, you'll find Charles Cotton Hotel. Let's go and have a look at Yorgreave. This is a nice little village, a little bit further north. Not so little, really. So there's Yorgreave, and then we'll go out to the other end. Hang on. How do you spell this place? Yorgreave, Yorgreave. This is a village at war with itself over spelling. So the Wesleyan Reformed Chapel is Yorgrave. The youth hostel is Yorgreave. And a local historian has actually found that there were over 60 possible spellings of the village of Yorgreave. So it's probably not that surprising that they still haven't kind of fitted on a final spelling. Interesting place, lovely little village, and I think one of its gems is the little River Bradford, which flows through Bradford Dale, and this has been particularly popular in recent weeks because there is a place where you can swim. Swimming pools are opening tomorrow, I'm told, but actually people have been swimming here along with one or two other open water swimming spots in Derbyshire. This is in fact designated as a swimming area, and there are mermaids there as well, as you can see. So it's not one of those places which says no swimming, go away, we don't want you. The Haddon Hall estate have actually said that yes, you can swim here, but it's at your own risk. So it's a great place, and I was there last night and it wasn't busy. On my way back, I came across this little character. So there's lots of wildlife there, more actually when there's fewer people there, but there was something quite interesting that I found last night at Yorgreave, so I wanted to share that. Next to the post box, there is this sign stuck on, well, it's a telegraph pole, in fact. What this is actually telling us is that local people are using too much of the water, using too many sprinklers and wasting the water. And I think what's really significant is that at the bottom, 191 years of history could end if this notice is not heeded. What are these people on about? This is what they're on about, that in 1829, the Yorgreave Friendly Society of Women established this cistern right in the middle of the village so that there could be fresh water supplied to villagers. And guess what? They established a water company which still to this day is independent and supplies water to the villagers in Hywel Greve, but clearly the people who manage it are getting a bit panicky about overuse, and because it's not linked into Severn Trent or any other supplier, it really clearly caused a lot of stress that people were not heeding the calls to be careful. Since that sign was put up, which I think was probably in June, we've actually had quite a lot of rain, so I think the worries are probably not there. Let's head north from Hywel Greve, or should it be Hywel Greve, to Eyam, or should it be Eyam? What is it? Well, this is probably the most topical village in Derbyshire, and many people will know the story of the plague. 1665, the plague was roaring away in London, hadn't really touched this part of the country, but some cloth arrived with a merchant travelling from London. It was damp, it was taken into this house and dried in front of the fire, and within days the occupants of the house had succumbed to the plague, and the plague then spread throughout the village. So they were on lockdown and it was quarantined, and the guy who really pushed this is how it spread. You can just see 6 deaths, 23 deaths, 8, 4. By 1666, it was really going crazily, and it was only by November that we had the final death there. There's the church, and this is the guy, Reverend Montpesson, who had only recently taken over as being the vicar in Eyam. Why had he only recently taken over this? Because there was the restoration at the end of the period of the Commonwealth in 1660. It was followed by an Act of Uniformity where the original prayer book was introduced, and the Puritan priest was kicked out because he wouldn't accept it. So Montpesson had taken over, and he's credited very often with being the guy who persuaded all of the locals that they must stay put and not rush off to other parts of the county and infect their neighbours. And so he was considered a hero, as were the villagers. But actually, he lost his wife. And if you go to the church, you can actually find her tomb, and Catherine Montpesson. And what I think is quite interesting to have a look at the tomb, that the stonemason clearly made a mistake in chipping out her name. Can you see that the O has actually had to be inserted afterwards? And I imagine that, he chipped a little bit too hard, and probably the whole middle came out. But in fact, this guy, I think, has now received quite a lot of recognition. He was the previous Puritan priest. He had nowhere to go when he was kicked out in 1661, didn't accept the Act of Uniformity, and he actually supported Montpesson. The two of them couldn't have disagreed more when it came to religious doctrine, but when it came to doing the right thing in the village, then he supported Montpesson. And I think that's increasingly recognised his role. When I say increasingly recognised his role, this is the Globe in London, and this is me standing in front of it. And this is about 18 months ago. There was a new play about Eyam. There have been several before, but I went along, met up with my daughter who lives in London, and when we went to the loo break in the middle of the performance, she came back and gave me a list of all of her school friends who'd moved to London from Derbyshire, from Wirksworth, who'd gone to the play. So play seemed to be nearly full of people speaking with Derbyshire accents. It was very moving. It was my first experience at the Globe, and what I found really moving was that at the end, the guy who played the Reverend Montpesson started by mentioning a couple of names of people who died, but he actually recited the names of over 200 of the villagers of Eyam who died. He remembered them all. I wouldn't have been able to do that. And he did it very, very movingly. Was very passionate. Right. Okay, so that's that. Oh, let's have a quick look at Bradbourne. That's near to Wirksworth, and it's got this great church. I've always enjoyed going to the carol concerts there just before Christmas, and it's got this 8th century cross. The top part of it's missing, but you've got still this great carving here of a crucifix at the bottom. And outside the front, you've got the War Memorial. Or is it the War Memorial? It should be, shouldn't it? It's where you'd expect the War Memorial to be, but it's not at all. This is because Bradbourne is one of, along with Butterton, which is another place in the Peak, is a doubly thankful village, somewhere where nobody died in combat in the First or the Second World War. We're on Throwley Hall, which is good. So let's get on to Galena. Galena isn't a Russian lady. Well, it could be a Russian lady's name, but in this case, it's the ore of lead. And we mentioned that the Romans were attracted by this. And here's an old lead mine. Lots and lots of places across the Peak where you'll find evidence of lead mining. Some as recently as the 1930s. I think the most recent lead mine was closed, or seriously commercial one was running then, but they go right back to Roman times. And the pig of lead found on Middleton Moor with Roman dating on it is actually in the British Museum. So it's been a very important part of the local economy. And there's there's sort of an expression locally, local people will know this very well, that where you see a place where there had been some activity of a lead mining nature, it will be Toad Man who did it. The old man was here. These are rather good. They're actually up at Middleton, and have fantastic flowers which just appear on the lead mine waste tip actually. Look at those, they're great. And this is another visit along a road, just coming along a road near Hartington. You see a few stinging nettles and a little bit of rock sticking out, worth having a look. When you get there, oh my God, there's a gate. And there's very clearly a tunnel going into a horizontal adit into a lead mine. And, you know, if somebody puts a gate up, all of a sudden I want to go in. I don't know about you, but it just always makes me want to think I want to get in there. And this wasn't locked. So I did go in. And there we are. There's the tunnel going in. Quite often these are called coffin levels, because not because people died in there, but because they were the wider further up to allow people's shoulders, so they were, and then there was a smaller space for the head, so there was sort of shape of a coffin. The other evidence of lead mining is very often in the names of pubs, and there's lots of miners' standards and miners' arms and so on. And this one's in Winster, and you can see that there's this dish of lead on the end of a chain. We've got all these miners' instruments here. And here we are, and there's that dish of ore again. And here we are at the Moot Hall in Wirksworth, which is where the traditional lead mining court has been meeting since 1814. There was an earlier site for the court in Wirksworth, I think nearer where the town hall is currently located. And the miner's dish here is used to verify the wooden dishes that were used by the miners to measure their ore. And this was because there would be a duty payable both to the landowner and also to the church as a proportion of the ore mined. And if the lead miner was going to be using his dish to measure out the ore, it needed to be checked against the volume of this one. The court does still meet, and I've been along to see the jury be sworn in. It's not often a lot of business, but sometimes there are little issues. And that's the building. Great to see that all of the lead miners' tools are here, and on this side we actually have the symbols of justice. We have the scales of justice, and then this very interesting symbol here, which is actually a fasces associated well before Mussolini adopted it as the symbol for his political party, but indicating that through unity there is strength. And there's the image of, or one image of a lead miner, and this one has acquired the name of Toad Man, although Toad Man gets used more widely to describe the activities of old miners. And this, in fact, is a stone currently, carved stone currently in the church at Wirksworth, although Bonsall feel that they should have it back, and there's a long story there that many people will know about. It was nice to see that when Pat Bracewell joined us in Wirksworth from California in the autumn, she took back the story of Toad Man. I think it turned up in her newsletter, which she sent out to the followers of her, people who are interested in her historical novels. So thanks for doing that, Pat. Great. Communications, and we're getting close to the end here, folks, because you know the pubs are open now and we've got lives to lead. But the railway companies were always very keen to get people to travel here for the scenery. This was actually British Railways, the Monsall Head Viaduct, but actually that's where it is today, and it is a very impressive place. No longer are there trains going across the viaduct, but we can walk and cycle across there, and it was a great achievement to open up the tunnels so that we can get through the whole length of the Monsall Trail now, almost up to Buxton, and should be completed. Now, this one greatly amuses me because it's the unparalleled travelling to London by stagecoach. And the stagecoach that did the trip from Manchester to London in 23 hours and will have come through the Peak District was called Peveril of the Peak. And it actually set off from a pub in Manchester of the same name. So the Peveril of the Peak pub exists in Manchester, but we have our own Peveril of the Peak hotel. This is in the village of Thorpe. It now does belong to HF Holidays. And there's a kind of link in the name to William de Peveril, who has slightly shadowy past. It's quite difficult to get clear facts about him, but he clearly was associated with William the Conqueror and was active at the Battle of Hastings and was given lands in Derbyshire. In particular, people know of Peveril Castle, which is near Castleton. I'm pretty sure that the pub in Manchester, the hotel in Thorpe, and the stagecoach have got very little to do with William de Peveril. I think they've got a lot more to do with this book by Sir Walter Scott that was published in the early part of the 19th century. And it's basically a story of two families split by their positions in the Civil War. And I think this was published just before the stagecoach was set up, and not long before the pub and the hotel were actually established. So I think they were more inspired by this, and the Peveril in the book is largely imaginary. Okay, again, we're coming close to the end, but these are waypoints on the tops of moors in particular. They're called stoops. And you could see it's very interesting that I doesn't come before E except after C, and road's got an E. And what's even more worrying is that back in the 18th century, people had a different number of fingers on their hands. The convention was always that when you looked at the words on the stoop, whatever the word said, it meant go right, as is shown here with the hand. But even if there was no hand pointing, it's still, if it said Derby, then you went right to get to Derby. Some of these are in the wrong place now, and that's thanks to Captain Mannering and his boys, because one of the jobs that the Home Guard did in the Second World War was to take these stoops and bury them. They collected all of the road signs and buried the stoops so that they would confound any possible paratroop invasion. It was the first decade of the 18th century when magistrates were empowered to set these up. And many places will have jaggers' lanes. A jagger was a leader of a pack of pack horses, and they were rough diamonds, really. People were usually quite happy for the jaggers to arrive and spend some money, but quite preferred it if they left before they started drinking. They were hard-living, hard-drinking guys. The horses that they used were Galloways. We tend to think of Galloways as being cattle now, but the Galloway ponies that we used for pack horsing are very stocky, short legs, but strong and powerful. Sometimes a jagger's lane typically won't be following the valley. It will be heading up out of a village onto the moor, onto the kind of tracks that only pack horses could survive across. Sometimes they're called salters lanes because the packs were very often carrying salt, particularly from Cheshire. Okay, here's one of the simplest maps you've ever seen in your life. This is the limestone of the Peak District. This is the White Peak where we came in. And in the southeast, or northwest, sorry, we have a canal called the Peak Forest Canal going up to Manchester, and we have a canal in the southeast called the Cromford Canal heading off down to the River Trent and down to the sea and Nottingham and all the rest of it. Now, the great idea by the 1820s to connect the two of them with a canal, and it was going to do that line there. Unfortunately, the people who were planning the canal hadn't been to my talk and didn't really clock that limestone is pervious. But they looked into this and it became very clear that it was not going to be possible to keep a canal at that height over the dry limestone plateau full of water. So there was a new technology coming in at the time, which was railways, and it was decided that they would incorporate or convert the canal into a railway. And those of us here in Wirksworth know this well. Cromford and High Peak Railway, and the original rails, you can see that they're fish belly rails, quite important because some of the earlier railways, the particularly Trevithick in Cornwall, been very successful in creating locomotives, but it hadn't been so successful in creating rails. The rails kept cracking, so the shape of the rail, stronger in the middle, was really an important feature here. And here we have, because the railway was designed as a canal, it's completely flat with some very steep bits, and the very steep bits involved having an engine to pull the trucks up. And there we are, that's a bit of a line of the railway. Just wanted to look at Whaley Bridge because I think this tells us a bit of a story that brings us up to date. when we look at Whaley Bridge, that's where the Cromford and High Peak Railway actually came in, and that's the line, and joined the canal. And you'll remember all of the fuss that was made in the autumn of last year. This is a few crises ago, but Toddbrook Reservoir was likely to be overflowing, and the whole of Whaley Bridge was threatened by this. Toddbrook Reservoir was built about 30 or more years after the Peak Forest Canal was built, because the canal in the valley was short of water. And so the reservoir that was threatening the village of the town of Whaley Bridge wasn't at all a drinking water reservoir. It was to support the canal. But I think that just shows that actually about 30 years after the canal was built, it was necessary to build a new reservoir to support the canal in the valley. There would have been no chance to have had enough water to cross the White Peak. Many people know that the Cromford and High Peak Railway is now a walking and cycling route, and it links up with the Tissington Trail. And if you're interested in the way that railways are actually engineered, these two railways were at opposite ends of the railway building era, and the Tissington Trail is built on a cut and fill basis, so there's no wasted material. All the material that was taken out of cuttings was used to create embankments, whereas the Cromford and High Peak is much more piecemeal, and you'll find places where they've excavated in order to help build the railway, and places where they've dumped material by the side of the route. Here's some people actually on it. This is actually an HF holiday cycling trip, and isn't it nice that this lady has actually got a cycling top that matches the willow herb? I think that's really very appropriate. Apparently it's the law that you have to have your photograph taken by the signal box at Hartington, and a visit to Tideswell is always a good thing. Lots of interesting ideas for old telephone boxes, quite often putting book exchanges in them, or defibrillators. But what I quite like about the one in Tideswell is that you pick up the phone and you press button 1 and you get one piece of local history. You press button 2 and you have another piece of local history. So it really becomes a sort of mini heritage centre, to be perfectly honest. Quite a small one, smaller than the one here in Wirksworth. And as you can see, really, Tideswell is subject to some quite severe earthquakes. By the shape of the photo there. I really should get somebody else to take the pictures rather than pass us by, shouldn't I? No walk is complete without a cup of tea, and this is on the green at Tissington. Just a reminder that the weather can get quite grim. This is the beast from the east, just over a year ago now, but the landscape does take on quite a special kind of feel to it. And yes, there really was a beast from the east, and here he is. But the weather warms up, and this is even in the winter, back up on the Dark Peak. And here we come to the spring, and I think the spring is probably a good time to stop for questions and comments. And I'm going to I'll do my best with questions and comments. I don't know everything about the Peak District, but I'm always interested in what people have got to share. So I'm going to pass you over to Gordon, who will field these.
Hello again, everyone. I think how we're going to do this is that if people would like to submit them by text, if you'd like to put them into the Q&A section that you should have access to in the bottom of your screens, or if you would like to try and ask your question directly to Alistair, if you raise your hand and everything's okay with Alistair, I can allow you to talk to him. Ooh. Okay, so I think I've got the first. Oh, okay. I thought we had a question which seems to have vanished. if anyone would like to. We have a... Okay, Alistair, can you see the questions that have popped up? We have a question from Rusty.
Are they in the chat?
They are in the Q&A section. So if you just click on the thing labeled Q&A at the bottom of the screen.
Yeah, okay. Okay, sorry, yeah, so the question is what sort of issues are now discussed in the moot hall? I think the main issue is what time we're going for lunch. But I do know that there have been issues relating to people wanting to start to use an old lead mine as a show cave, for example. So they might actually go and establish their right to open up an old mine as a show cave. I'm not a huge expert on mining law, but one of the great things about mining law is that you can actually mine on someone else's land. You need to go through a particular procedure involving nicking a mining area, and you would need the approval of the Barmote Court, and they would ensure that you paid the necessary mineral dues to both the church and also to the landowner. Okay, Rob's asking me if I can say something about SUFs. Yeah. SUFs are horizontal adits built horizontally into a lead mine in order to drain them. We have a place in Wirksworth called SUF Lane. Notably, there's the Meerbrook SUF, which drains into the River Derwent, and the result of that was that the water table around Wirksworth was much reduced, became a lot lower, allowing mining at a deeper level, but actually meaning there was much less surface water in the town than there had been before. Kathy's wondering whether J.K. Rowling pinched the word muggles from the Muggletonians. Well, J.K. Rowling, she seems to miss out on coming to my talks, so I've not had the chance to ask her that, Kathy, but I will ask her next time she comes.
Sorry, Alistair, if I may just jump in. I'm not an expert on Harry Potter or J.K. Rowling by any stretch, but I do know that a lot of the names in her books were borrowed from other names, so there's every chance, yes, she did. I know, for example, some of the characters in her book feature in gravestone names in Edinburgh. So there's a professor, or not a professor, but there's a McGonagall buried in a cemetery in Edinburgh, as well as several other characters from her books. So there's every chance that she did do.
You never know when you're going to turn up in a book, do you? Yeah, it's a fantastic name, Muggletonian, isn't it? It's too good to not to get used. Would it be possible to share the walk to Throwley Hall? Throughout it's pronounced is THOWLEY, Throwley Hall, Jacqueline. Well, to be honest, it's there's a whole network of footpaths around there. You can drive to the hall and park on the grass, so there's not room for a lot of cars. You could actually walk there from Ilam. You could park in Ilam, and Jacqueline, I'll quite happily show you all sorts of things on the map afterwards. Pat, do you know if Eden Village was the model for the village in Geraldine Brooks' novel Year of Wonders? Oh gosh, all these questions about literature. I have no idea. Does it, Pat? Does it feel very like that? Is there a story of a plague? Is it the same kind of story of people who quarantined themselves? I'll see whether you type back. I know we haven't got the mics open, have we? Is it possible to open my Pat's mic? Oh, well, in that case, Pat, it absolutely is. You know, it's a 17th century plague village of people who quarantined themselves. Yeah, I'll have to look out Geraldine Brooks. Sounds like a good one. Great. Any more questions coming in now? Coming in, or questions or comments? Okay, what I'm inclined to say, Gordon, if it's all right with you, is that, you know, we've actually gone on longer than we said, and people may have other things to do. Thank you, Kathy, that's lovely. I'm going to just go to my final couple of slides. I will share my email address with you, so if there are any specific queries, I'm very happy to do my best. So let's come up to this. There we are. So the questions and comments and that wonderful view actually of, sorry, within a minute, of Carsington Water and all those wonderful yellow flowers at the beginning of the season. And we're back to the entrance to Dovedale. This is the place, if you remember, that Wainwright believed should be the beginning of the Pennine Way, and it certainly is the start of higher land in England. This is Bunster Hill to the left and the edge of Thorpe Cloud to the right. That was the view of Thorpe Cloud that I showed you right at the beginning, that wonderful peaky, pointy picture. But you know, everybody, when they explore the world, has their own perspective. You bring your own experiences, your own expectations, your own interests, and it is all relative, because if you walk a mile towards the village of Irelham, that hill looks like that. It's got a flat top. So that's Thorpe Cloud from the village of Irelham with a flat top. Still a very impressive peaky, pointy hill, but you can't say it's totally representative of the Peak District, which really is more plateaus. Can I thank you everybody for coming along today. There's my email address, and could I give a special thanks to the Heritage Centre for inviting me to come along today. It's a tough time for everybody who's working in the cultural and heritage sector. A lot of loss of income, a lot of loss of momentum, for quite understandable reasons. But please do continue to support the Heritage Centre, and who knows, I might even get invited back again. Thanks, folks. Cheers.
Alistair, thank you. Thank you ever so much for that. A quick round of applause from the two of us here. And if you've enjoyed that, hopefully you'll get the opportunity to attend our next talks. Gordon actually mentioned when the next one is, which is the 7th of August. But we will be doing future ones, both by Zoom, and hopefully in the not too distant future we'll be able to resume a physical presence here at the Heritage Centre. So please do look out for that, and thank you ever so much for supporting us tonight.